Centuries ago, people treated curses with fear and reasonable caution. Only in modern times have people forgotten the origins of these stories, dismissing spirits, demons, and curses as mere fiction or horror movie fantasies. However, the price for such recklessness can often be fatal. It began with curiosity, mixed with arrogance and a touch of boredom. A group of 5 friends, Mia, Derek, Rachel, Connor, and Liv, gathered outside an abandoned office building on a chilly Friday night. They were armed with flashlights, their phones, and a printout of instructions. The target of their latest thrill-seeking adventure was the elevator game, an urban legend that promised access to another dimension for those brave, or foolish, enough to follow its sequence. The rules were simple but ominous. Enter an elevator in an empty building. Ride it to specific floors in a specific order, 4th, 2nd, 6th, and so on. Do not speak to anyone who enters the elevator. Do not exit until the ritual is complete. And most importantly, if you reach the 10th floor, you must not step out, no matter what you see. "It's just a game, right?" Derek said, rolling his eyes at the trembling hesitation on Mia's face. "It's not like we're going to actually find another dimension. Worst case, we get some cool TikTok footage." But even Derek's bravado faltered as they pried open the rusted front doors of the building. The place had been abandoned for years, yet the air inside felt thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. Their footsteps echoed eerily as they approached the lone elevator at the end of the darkened lobby. The elevator doors slid open with a groan, revealing an ancient, dimly lit interior. The group squeezed in, their laughter already quieter than before. Derek, holding the printed rules, pressed the button for the 4th floor. The first few stops were uneventful, though a strange chill seemed to grow with each floor. The friends joked nervously, trying to shake the oppressive silence. On the 6th floor, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of movement in the hallway before the doors slid shut again. On the 2nd floor, Liv swore she heard faint whispers from the dark corridor beyond. By the time they reached the 9th floor, the tension in the elevator was palpable. The air seemed heavier, the flickering light above them casting strange shadows on the walls. Derek hesitated as he pressed the button for the 10th floor. "Are we really doing this?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Connor replied, forcing a grin. But even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The elevator lurched as it began its ascent to the 10th floor, the hum of the machinery sounding almost like a low, growling moan. When the doors opened, the group fell silent. The floor beyond wasn't a normal hallway. It stretched infinitely, cloaked in darkness except for the dim light spilling from the elevator cab. Strange, flickering shapes moved in the distance, their forms too twisted and jerky to be human. "Close the doors," Mia whispered, clutching Derek's arm. But Connor stepped forward, squinting into the void. "Guys, I think I see someone out there." Sure enough, a figure was emerging from the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnervingly fluid. "Connor, get back!" Mia screamed, but Connor was transfixed. The figure extended an impossibly long arm, and the elevator doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. The cab plunged downward, the lights flickering wildly as the friends screamed. When the elevator stopped, the doors opened again, but they weren't back in the lobby. The hallway before them was warped, the walls seeming to pulse like a living organism. Doors lined the corridor, each slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of impossible horrors. A room filled with whispering shadows, a staircase spiraling endlessly upward, a mirror that reflected none of them but seemed to breathe. "What the hell is this place?" Rachel whimpered, clutching Mia's hand. "It's part of the game," Derek said, his voice hollow. "We have to finish it. It's the only way out." They pressed the buttons, retracing the sequence with trembling fingers. But the elevator no longer followed the rules. Each stop pulled them further into the nightmare. At the 5th floor, Derek disappeared, lured out by a faint laugh echoing from one of the rooms. Liv was next, dragged screaming into a hallway that sealed itself before the others could follow. By the time Mia and Rachel reached the 10th floor again, they were alone. "This is it," Rachel whispered. "We leave now, or we don't leave at all." But when the doors opened, the void was waiting. The flickering shadows had grown closer, and this time, the figure stepped inside. Mia and Rachel tried to back away, but the elevator had no walls now, just an endless expanse of darkness. The figure's outline multiplied, surrounding them as their screams echoed into nothingness. The next morning, the office building stood silent as always. The elevator sat on the ground floor, its doors wide open. Inside, there was no sign of the 5 friends, only a single slip of paper crumpled in the corner. It bore the rules of the elevator game, now smudged and incomplete. At the bottom, a new line had been scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You can never win." Darren had always dreamt of solitude. As a struggling writer, the distractions of city life had become unbearable, and the offer of a secluded cabin deep in the woods seemed like a gift from the universe. The price was too good to be true, but he didn't question it. Nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the cabin exuded rustic charm with its weathered wood and moss-covered roof. For Darren, it was the perfect sanctuary, a place to finally finish his novel. The real estate agent had been eager to close the deal. "The previous owner left abruptly," she mentioned casually, avoiding Darren's gaze. "You know how it is with these remote places. Some people just can't handle the isolation." Darren shrugged it off, chalking it up to eccentric behavior. The first few days were blissful. Darren set up his workspace by the wide window overlooking the backyard, where an ancient oak tree stood like a silent guardian. He spent his mornings writing and his afternoons exploring the dense forest. It was during one of these walks that he noticed the first oddity, a pile of small white bones arranged in a neat circle near the base of the oak tree. He crouched down to examine them, curiosity overriding his discomfort. They appeared to be animal bones, cleaned and polished to an unnatural sheen. He swept them aside, thinking they might have been left by some animal or perhaps a hunter passing through. That night, as the wind howled outside, Darren heard faint scratching sounds coming from the backyard. He tried to ignore it, but when it grew louder, he grabbed a flashlight and ventured out to investigate. The circle of bones had returned, perfectly arranged as if they had never been disturbed. This time they were closer to the cabin. The pattern repeated itself for days. No matter how many times Darren scattered the bones or buried them, they always reappeared. They began to take on more intricate designs, lines, spirals, and symbols Darren couldn't understand. What unnerved him the most was that the circles seemed to be moving closer and closer to the cabin, as if something was closing in on him. Then came the noises. At first they were faint, a rustling in the trees, a distant thud. But soon, Darren began hearing whispers. They were soft, almost inaudible, but persistent, filling the silence of the night with their insidious presence. Sometimes he thought he heard his name. One evening, as he was digging a fire pit near the oak tree, his shovel struck something hard. Curious, he cleared away the dirt and uncovered a skeletal hand. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly he unearthed more bones, piecing together what was unmistakably a human skeleton. Darren stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The next morning, he called the local sheriff, who arrived with a small team of investigators. Sheriff Langley was a grizzled man with a weary demeanor, and his reaction to the discovery was more resigned than shocked. "This cabin's got a history," Langley said, his voice low. "Locals tell stories about it being cursed. The previous owner disappeared without a trace, just like the one before him. And now, here we are again." As the forensic team worked, they uncovered not one but 3 more skeletons buried near the oak tree. Langley's face grew grim. "You might want to find another place to stay," he advised Darren. "This land has a way of keeping people." Darren tried to leave that very day, but his car wouldn't start. Frustrated, he decided to wait until morning to call for a tow truck. That night, the whispers became louder, more insistent. He heard knocking on the walls and the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. When he peered outside, his blood ran cold. Figures made of bones stood in the clearing, their skeletal forms illuminated by the pale moonlight. They were grotesque amalgamations of animal and human bones, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Darren slammed the door and locked it, his mind racing. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled for a flashlight. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. Suddenly, a deafening thud echoed through the cabin, followed by a low, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You've disturbed the collector's ground." Darren turned toward the window and froze. A towering figure stood outside, cloaked in shadows. Its skeletal face was obscured by a hood, and in its bony hand, it held a staff adorned with human skulls. The bone creatures parted as it approached the cabin, their movements unnaturally synchronized. The front door creaked open. Darren's flashlight flickered, and in its unsteady beam, he saw the shadowy figure step inside. The bone creatures followed, their hollow sockets fixed on him. Darren's screams echoed into the night, but no one was there to hear them. The next morning, Sheriff Langley returned to the cabin, only to find it eerily silent. Darren was gone, his belongings untouched. In the backyard, a new arrangement of bones had appeared. This time, a crude human figure laid out beneath the oak tree. The cabin remains abandoned, and the locals refuse to go near it. Some claim to hear whispers when the wind blows through the trees, while others swear they've seen figures watching from the shadows. But no one dares disturb the bone collector's ground again. After a long day of driving across endless stretches of highway and desolate farmland, the Carter family spotted a modest roadside motel emerging out of the fog. It was a faded, weather-worn building with an old, cracked neon sign that read, "Willow Creek Motel," in flickering red letters. The sign looked as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. Exhausted from their trip, they decided to pull over and spend the night. The motel had only a few rooms, its parking lot almost completely empty save for one rusted sedan. The clerk at the front desk was friendly enough, albeit slightly odd, with hollow, sunken eyes and a strange smile that didn't quite reach his face. He welcomed them and gave them a single key to a small, dingy room in the back corner of the property. "Hope you sleep well," he said, in a voice that was far too soft to be heard over the sound of the pouring rain that had begun to fall. The family didn't think much of it. After all, they were tired. But as they brought their bags into the room, they began to notice things. Subtle, inexplicable things. The air felt damp, colder than it should have been for the season. Dead moths were scattered on the carpet, their wings crinkled and lifeless, as if they had been swarming in search of light only to find themselves trapped in this dreary place. At first, they tried to brush it off as a simple housekeeping issue, but then came the sound. It started softly, almost unnoticeable, a low, scraping sound. It came from just outside the window. The sound would stop when they paused to listen, only to resume moments later. When they peeked through the curtains, they saw nothing but the shadows of trees swaying gently in the wind. Still, something felt wrong. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the sound of rain pattered rhythmically against the window panes, the father noticed something strange. A figure just outside the window. A tall, thin, winged silhouette moved slowly through the mist and the shadows, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. His heart froze as he tried to convince himself that it was just the wind or a trick of his mind. But it wasn't. The figure didn't leave. He stared in horror as the shadowy wings stretched and shifted, taking a shape unmistakably unnatural. A large creature with glowing red eyes and vast, shadowy wings. The father tried to wake his wife, but the sound in his head, the sound of the wings scraping against the air, was deafening now. His hands trembled as he tried to unlock the window to get a better look, but before he could, the figure seemed to vanish, retreating into the mist. They tried to ignore the incident, attributing it to stress, exhaustion, or some kind of optical illusion. But the feeling lingered, the feeling of being watched. The following morning, the family found the strange moths again. They were in their belongings, crawling from inside a duffel bag, their small, dead wings glinting faintly in the gray morning light. Their presence was inexplicable. They hadn't come from outside. The children were frightened, and so was the mother. Something about this place felt sinister, as though it had eyes that saw everything, as if it were alive. As they packed their things and prepared to leave, they noticed that the receptionist had disappeared. The man at the front desk had been gone, his absence unaccounted for, though the light in his office was still faintly glowing. The family didn't dwell on it for long. They hurried into their car, eager to leave the desolate motel and its strange atmosphere behind. But as they pulled onto the highway, the mist followed them. The drive became increasingly uneasy. The sound of wings scratching against wind seemed to follow them. Every turn in the road felt tighter, the trees on either side of the highway too dense, too watchful. A sudden memory surfaced, a story, a legend whispered in the small towns and forgotten woods of this region. The Mothman, a creature of wings and glowing eyes, a harbinger of doom, a curse that stalks those who dare to stay on the paths that twist too far into the unknown. By the time they looked at their rearview mirror again, the mist had grown denser. A shadow flitted across the road behind them, a dark, winged shape that flew on silent, terrible wings. The family would never return to Willow Creek, nor would they ever forget the feeling of cold eyes watching them in the mist, and they would always wonder if it had followed them.